The next section of this OPT online course will discuss your initial 12 months of OPT. In this section, you will learn the distinction between pre-completion OPT and post-completion OPT. You will also learn how to determine your completion date, which may not always be the same as your graduation date, which will be explained later in this section. We will also discuss the timeline for submitting your OPT application to the United States Immigration Service, which we will refer to as USCIS throughout this course. Finally, we will discuss how to choose the date you wish to begin your OPT. This is one of the most difficult things for many students, so please follow closely because we cannot choose that start date for you. You must choose it yourself. So, let's begin by discussing pre-completion and post-completion OPT, as well as your completion date. Pre-completion OPT means that you have been approved for employment that begins and ends before the completion of your degree requirements. Post-completion OPT is when your employment has been approved to begin and end after you complete your degree requirements. So then, how do we know what the date is that you complete your degree requirements? Your completion date is the last day of the last month you are enrolled in credits required for your degree program. If your last term of enrollment is winter semester, your completion date would be April 30th. If your last term of enrollment is spring semester, your completion date would be June 30th. If you are enrolled for spring-summer semester as your final term, August 31st will be your completion date. For fall, your completion date would be December 31st. Depending on your degree level and your department's requirements, your date of graduation and your final term of enrollment may be different. For example, for a PhD student defending after the end of the semester, but before the end of the Rackham grace period to prevent enrolling another semester, the graduation date would likely be the semester after, but your completion date is still your last term of full-time enrollment. At the master's level, if you have completed all course requirements for your degree, but are still completing an optional master's thesis without being required to continue to enroll in classes, your date of completion is determined by the last semester you were enrolled. Remember, this date of completion that we are discussing is for immigration purposes only. This has nothing to do with your academic completion date or graduation date. There are, however, two exceptions to this rule. Professional schools, such as the law school, may have completion dates in May. Please refer to your I-20 or ask an International Center advisor to find out if you are part of this exception. Also, PhD students who defend before the end of the last term they are enrolled full-time may have the option of using their defense date as their completion date instead of the term in which they defend. This defense must be before the end of the term, not during the Rackham grace period. Now that you know how to determine your completion date, let's discuss pre-completion OPT. Remember, this is employment authorization that begins and ends before the completion of your degree requirements. Pre-completion OPT is uncommon. Most students prefer to save their OPT eligibility for after they complete all of their degree requirements. So check to see if you are eligible for CPT first, because pre-completion OPT also expects that you would already have a definite job offer, so the start date and end dates are certain. There are three types of pre-completion OPT. The first is during the annual vacation, which would be during summer. In order to be eligible to be authorized for OPT for the summer, you must intend to register full-time for the following term. you may request part or full-time OPT during this period. If you request full-time OPT, there is no limit on the number of hours you can work, but you must be working at a minimum of 20 hours a week. If you request part-time OPT, you cannot work more than 20 hours per week during this work authorization, and there is no minimum number of hours. If you are approved for part-time pre-completion OPT, the number of months that you are approved only count 50% towards the total of 12 months of OPT you are eligible for. This means that if you request 4 months of pre-completion part-time OPT, only 2 months counts towards the total of 12 that you are eligible. The second type of pre-completion OPT is employment authorization during the regular school year, which means fall or winter semester. Full-time registration is required during these terms, therefore you are only eligible to request part-time work authorization. The third type of pre-completion OPT is for PhD students only. Some master's candidates completing a required thesis may also be eligible. This work authorization would be approved to begin after all required courses have been completed, but before the dissertation or thesis has been defended. If you are authorized for part-time pre-completion OPT during this period, you must be registered full-time for both fall and winter semesters. If you are authorized for full-time pre-completion OPT, full-time registration is not required, but it is very important that you check with your department to find out the academic requirements and make sure it's okay not to be enrolled full-time during this period. For anyone completing their degree requirements during pre-completion OPT, it is very important to note that as soon as your completion date has arrived, your pre-completion OPT has expired. Therefore, if you want to continue to have work authorization beyond your completion date, you must file a separate post-completion OPT application with USCIS and make sure that you apply in enough time to get authorization to allow post-completion OPT to begin the day after your completion date. So, if you want to apply for either pre-completion or post-completion OPT, it's very important to know that USCIS may take up to 90 days to process this application, so please plan accordingly. We will help you with the application timeline later in this section. There are, however, limitations to how early you can submit this application to allow for this processing time. If you have not yet completed 1 academic year, which means 2 consecutive semesters of full-time enrollment, your application cannot be received by USCIS more than 90 days before the last day of your 2nd semester of full-time enrollment. And for pre-completion OPT, your employment start date cannot be before the end of your 1st academic year. And if you have completed 1 academic year or more, USCIS will accept your application up to 90 days before your employment start date. Next, we will discuss post-completion OPT. Remember, this is when the employment authorization begins and ends after the completion of your degree program. There are 3 types of post-completion OPT. Your initial 12 months, which could be reduced if you've used any pre-completion OPT, 17-month STEM extension, and CAP-GAP extension. These 2 extensions are in addition to your initial 12 months. These will be discussed in Section 5. Any information discussed in the rest of this section will only refer to the initial 12 months, unless stated otherwise. You are not required to have a job offer in order to apply for post-completion OPT. you must request a start date for your post-completion OPT during your 60-day grace period. Remember, your grace period begins the day after your completion date. If you have not begun a job by the time your OPT has been approved to begin, you may continue to look for a job up to 90 days. If 90 days has passed and you have not begun a job yet, you must either leave the United States or apply for a different immigration status. This 90 days of unemployment is cumulative. It does not only apply to the beginning of your OPT authorization. If you become unemployed during your initial 12 months at any time or multiple times, all of this unemployment period counts towards the 90 days of unemployment. One more important note is that you must begin the job within this 90 days. You can not only have a job offer and begin after the 90 days expires. You may apply for post-completion OPT no more than 90 days before your completion date and no more than 60 days after your completion date. If your application is not received by the USCIS before the end of your grace period, no OPT will be authorized. You must leave the United States as quickly as possible. Now let's take a look at the timeline for you to submit your post-completion OPT application. The area shaded in blue is the 5-month OPT application period. Remember, your OPT application must be received by USCIS no more than 90 days before your completion date and no more than 60 days after your completion date. The area shaded in orange is your 12-month OPT authorization period. If you have used any pre-completion OPT, you will not have the full 12 months of authorization. Subtract the amount of time you used for pre-completion OPT, and you will have the amount of months you are eligible for post-completion. When calculating how much pre-completion you have used, remember, any full-time pre-completion OPT is counted at 100%. So if you have used 3 months of pre-completion OPT, you only have 9 months remaining after you complete your degree. And any part-time pre-completion OPT is counted at 50%. So if you used 4 months of pre-completion OPT, you would subtract 2 months from the total of 12 months of eligibility for post-completion OPT, and you will only have 10 months eligible to request post-completion. The section shaded in green is your additional 60-day grace period after your OPT expires. During this period, you have absolutely no work authorization unless you have been approved for another status that allows you to work, such as an H-1B, or an extension, which will be discussed in Section 5. Your other options during this time are to go back to school and have your SEVIS record transferred to the new institution, or leave the United States before the end of this grace period. We will discuss this further in Section 5. If you would like to print a copy of this post-completion OPT timeline, please pause this video, click on the link labeled Post-Completion OPT Timeline, and a PDF version of this timeline will pop up and you will be able to print it for your records. Let's take a closer look at the OPT application period. Remember, your completion date is the last day of the last term that you are enrolled full-time in courses required for your degree program. You can apply up to 90 days before this completion date and up to 60 days after. If you choose to send your OPT application to USCIS during your grace period, make sure you send it early enough so that your application arrives at USCIS before the 60th day, or your application will be rejected. OPT applications must be received by USCIS before the end of your grace period. Just sending it before the deadline is not sufficient. Your OPT start date must be requested by you No one else can request this date. And that date must be during the 60-day grace period. There are no exceptions to any of these requirements. Now, let's figure this out together. Please pause this video for a moment to allow for you to print a copy of this slide. Go to the link labeled OPT Application Period. Click on that, print the PDF, and follow along the next few slides. Now, on your worksheet, write your completion date in the appropriate area. For this example, we will use April 30th, since this is the most common completion date for all University of Michigan International students. Remember, if your last term of enrollment is winter semester, April 30th is your completion date. June 30th for spring. Spring-summer is August 31st, and fall is December 31st. If you are in a professional school such as the law school, please refer to your I-20 to find out your completion date. Now, count 60 days to the future. This is the end of your grace period. For this example, the end of this person's 60-day grace period will be June 29th. You must request an OPT start date during this period. No exceptions. And this date is your choice. No one else can make the choice for you. If you know the date you want to begin your OPT, please mark that during the 60-day grace period. For this example, we're going to use June 1st. Now, count backward 90 days from the date you want to begin your employment. This is the date that you should apply for OPT in order for it to be approved in time for you to begin on the date you have chosen. For this example, this student should apply to USCIS no later than March 1st. For this student, if he or she wanted added security to be sure that his or her OPT is approved by the date that was requested, then he or she has up to 90 days before the completion date to apply for OPT. This means this student can apply as early as February 1st and allow 4 months for the application process. A very important note to make at this point is that if you do not request your OPT to begin the day after your completion date, you will have a period of no work authorization. This means no work on or off campus at all during this period. If you are unsure which date you want to choose as your start date for OPT, we cannot help you decide, but you will get tips for choosing a start date at the end of this section. To avoid a gap between your completion date and your work authorization, you should choose the day after your completion date as the start date of your post-completion OPT. This will shift the application timeline for this student back 1 month, therefore making February 1st the earliest date he or she can apply for OPT, as well as the latest date he or she should apply in order to receive work authorization on the date requested. If this person's application is received after February 1st by the USCIS, there is no guarantee that the work authorization will be approved by May 1st. If you are still having a hard time choosing the start date of your OPT, here are a few tips to help. If you have a job offer and the start date of that job is during the 60-day grace period, you can use that date to maximize the time you have on your OPT. Just remember that you will likely have no work authorization between your completion date and the start date of your OPT. If your job starts after your 60-day grace period expires, request the latest date possible. We recommend that the latest date you use is the 59th day of your grace period. This will help ensure that there is no confusion as to when your 60-day grace period ends and whether or not you have requested a day within that period. If your job begins before your completion date, make an appointment with an International Center advisor. You may or may not be eligible for employment before your completion date. Therefore, it is important you get the advice from the International Center as to what your options may be. Please remember, it is only you who can choose your OPT start date. Please choose whatever you are most comfortable with. Now we will go over the positives and negatives of choosing earlier dates or later dates in your 60-day grace period when you do not yet have a job offer. The positive side of requesting a date early during your grace period to begin your OPT without a job offer is that if you do receive an offer of employment, your employer will be very impressed that you can start at the earliest available moment. The negative side to this is that if you do not find a job quickly, you may risk being unemployed for 90 days and lose your F1 immigration status. At that point in time, you may need to leave the United States. If you request a date towards the end of your 60-day grace period, you may have less of a chance of being unemployed for 90 days and be required to leave the United States. The negative side to this is that if you receive a job offer early in those 60 days and they want you to begin sooner than later, you may risk having the job offer rescinded since the date is uncertain or too far in the future for the beginning of your work authorization. Some students are so worried that they're not going to find a job that they send their OPT application into USCIS very late during the grace period and do not receive work authorization until far after the grace period has ended. We do not recommend that you take this approach. The only positive aspect of this choice would be that your OPT would start very far into the future and you would not have to worry as much about being unemployed for 90 days and being required to leave the United States. There are many reasons why you should not send your application in to the USCIS as late as possible. These include the fact that your OPT start date will be uncertain, and therefore you cannot tell your employer when you can start a job. This could mean a job offer would be rescinded. Also, your dates cannot be changed after your OPT is approved, so you cannot request earlier dates after you've already sent the application in. And also, you will not receive all 12 months of OPT. Remember this timeline from earlier in this section? The reason you will not receive all 12 months of your OPT authorization if eligible, if you apply for your OPT very late in your grace period, is because your 12 months of OPT must be completed within 14 months of your completion date. In the example we have been using, our student's completion date was April 30th. Therefore, the end of the grace period was June 29th. If the application was received by USCIS on June 29th, the 90-day application period would go up until October 1st. Therefore, it is very possible that this student will not be approved to begin their OPT until October 1st. This means that only 9 months remain for which OPT can be authorized. This person's OPT must expire June 29th of the following year because that is 14 months from the date of completion date, and there is no exceptions to this rule. Another very important issue to consider is that if you choose to submit your OPT application as late as possible during the grace period, you will not have any work authorization for the time that the OPT application is pending in addition to the grace period. This means that you could find yourself with absolutely no work authorization for up to 5 months. You are considered to still be in F1 status during this period, but if you want to travel outside of the United States, there is an increased risk. We will discuss this in Section 5. You have now completed Section 2 of this course. In this section, you should have learned the difference between pre-completion and post-completion OPT, how to figure out your completion date, when you should request your OPT I-20 from the International Center, when you should send your OPT application to USCIS, and how to determine your requested OPT start date. If you are unsure of any of this information, please review this section again before moving on. If you feel you understand all of the information presented in this section, please take the following quiz. Once you have answered every question correctly, you will be prompted to move on to Section 3.